founder of Radical Management, and that's Steve Denning.
Thanks very much, and delighted to be with you. And after all that's been said, these wonderful presentations throughout the day, what can I add? Well, I thought it might be useful to just look back on what's happened over the year and also look forward and suggest, in fact, 5 guideposts for the future for the Stoos movement. And as I look back over the year, I mean, it's been a remarkable year. It's been a very good year. We started off with 4 people, and that went to 21, and now it's more than 1,500. And at that pace, by 2016, we will have the entire world's population as just do the math, and it's also been a good year in terms of substance. That a number of the pillars of 20th century management have started to crumble. The maximizing shareholder value had a really bad year, and the Drucker forum laid into that. Michael Porter's sustainable competitive advantage also had a bad year when Monitor consulting firm went bankrupt, and international offshoring has also really come under major scrutiny, and Boeing's current troubles underline that. And even executive compensation, excessive executive compensation was laid into with Harvard Business Review did a major article during the year. So overall, throughout the year, there's a much sharper and wider awareness that we're in a different kind of economy, a more creative kind of an economy. And we also saw a number of large organizations coming out and standing up for this change in the economy, this change that we're talking about in the Stoos movement. I mean, Whole Foods is one recent example, but there were many others throughout the year. So although we're not at a tipping point, we do see important signs that we are moving steadily towards that. And I think most importantly, there's a recognition, as a number of speakers have underlined, that this is a paradigm shift. This is not just a couple of new tools or processes. This is a fundamental shift. So I was a little bit nervous about what my good friend Roger Martin was saying, that stewardship is tweaking. And he gave examples of a big shift, he said, that hadn't worked, the Dodd-Frank financial legislation in the U.S. And I would agree with him that legislation hasn't worked, but it's, in my sense, it's not a big shift at all. I mean, it's a law that has 850 pages of inspections and controls and rules and regulations, and it's going to be followed up by 30,000 pages of rules and inspections and controls. And this is simply a continuation of command and control. It's not a big shift at all. So it's not a good example of a big shift that's worked. It's certainly an example of something that wasn't a qualitative shift at all. What is, I think, a huge shift is that stewardship of the living is a transformational idea. It's as transformational as the idea of the Earth, the sun revolving around the Earth, to a shift where the Earth revolves around the sun. You can't make that kind of a shift by tweaking. You have to change your whole mindset of what the world looks like and how you interact with the world. So this is a wrenching shift. It's an abrupt shift. And once you make that shift, then I agree you need to get into a tweaking mode to see how do you actually make that happen. When you look at a big organization like General Electric, you see a whole set of people within General Electric, say the GE Health Group, where they are very much in the Stoos mode of a stewardship of the living with agile approaches, but the whole organization is not. The whole organization is still in a 20th century mode. So there's a whole, I would call it not so much tweaking, but a guerrilla warfare going on between General Electric's overall management and the revolutionaries who see the world differently But it is, I think, as Roger suggested, a set of small steps getting from here to there. But as we look forward, I'm going to suggest that there are 5 guideposts to the future. The first is that I think we need to recognize the extent of the challenge that we're facing. The sad thing, as Niels pointed out earlier in the day, a number of the other speakers, that many of the ideas that we're talking about are not exactly new. The human dimension of organization was talked about by Mary Parker Follett in the 1920s. And then you had Elton Mayo and Chester Barnard in the 30s, and Maslow in the 1940s, and McGregor in the 1960s, and Peters and Waterman in the 80s, and on and on. In fact, throughout the 20th century, there were people articulating the very ideas that we are talking about today, but we see that, in fact, those ideas didn't stick, that management of the machine remained remarkably resilient to change. So simply articulating the idea of stewardship of the living is not enough. We have to do more. So what are the things that we need to do more of to make this happen? Well, the second thing, after recognizing the extent of the change, we have to think bigger. I mean, 1,500 people is more than 4 people, but that's not nearly big enough for the kind of change that we're talking about. So for the coming year, what we're already talking about is how do we become not just a huge movement, but a movement of movements. As we look around the world, there are a number of other movements which are basically pushing in the same direction. The Management Information Exchange with Gary Hamel, the Drucker Forum, the Beyond Budgeting Roundtable that have been talked about, the Scrum Alliance. Scrum Alliance has 200,000 people as part of it. The Agile Alliance, probably about the same size, and the Society for Organizational Learning. These are collectively a huge movement, maybe 500,000 people who basically share the same values that we're talking about. So what if we were able to form all of these organizations into a huge movement that was together pushing for the change? We need to think bigger. So becoming a movement of movements is what I see as a big step to be taken in the coming year. So we need to realize the resistance, we need to become bigger, and thirdly, we need to be bolder. We know that this army of people believes in what we're talking about, stewardship of the living, and we also know that many thought leaders around the world also have been arguing for such changes for quite some time. So I think it's fair to say that we have truth on our side, but simply having truth on our side is not enough. We have to be bolder in making our ideas heard. We have to insist on change. We have to speak with a voice that enables our voice to be heard. We need to get beyond tweaking. We need to mobilize this army and have that army speak with this voice, this clear, coherent, consistent, powerful voice. And fourthly, we need to get the army of believers, this 500,000 people, working on the constraints. We need a practical agenda, not simply talking to themselves and saying how wonderful Agile is, or how wonderful Stoos is, or how wonderful Scrum is, but practical actions that can lead to change. Now, what sort of actions would they be? Well, I don't think it's civil action. Having them all camp outside Davos next year might get some publicity, but I don't think it would get the kind of change, the lasting, sustainable change. What we need to do is to mobilize this army, focusing on, in part, on the constraints for change. Take the business schools. Maybe no more than 20% of the business schools support the kind of change that we're talking about. Why is that? What could be done to change the business schools so that at least 80% of the professors there were pushing for change? And the business journals, suppose that we were evaluating every issue of Harvard Business Review and pointing out that only no more than 20% of their articles were talking about current relevant ideas, and that 80% of their articles were about obsolete ideas, or the consulting firms, or Wall Street. Suppose that we were providing these various areas which are really constraints for change, providing them with rational ideas why they should get into a different mode. So using this army for practical steps to advance the agenda and remove the constraints for change. So it needs to be recognizing the resistance, becoming a bigger force, becoming a bolder force, removing the constraints, and finally, most powerfully, evangelizing the change. I believe that we have better ideas. We have truth on our side, but we've seen over the last 90 years that rational argument is not enough to get this done. We need to express ourselves with passion, with energy, and it's that passion and our belief that this is inevitable, that this is inexorable, that will enable it to happen. I mean, if you think about Martin Luther King, if he had said, I have a dream, but I'm not sure whether people are really up to it, he would never have made the slightest impact in the world. So we'd have to present these ideas not timidly, like we have an interesting idea that we think you might consider. It has to be, God damn it, this idea has to happen. This farm is going down the drain unless we do something about that. Let's do it. It's that kind of passion which is actually going to make. So that's how I see the future going forward, these 5 things. Recognize the resistance, become a bigger force for change, become a bolder force for change, have a practical agenda to deal with the constraints, and evangelize with passion, energy, emotion, and feeling. And it may seem as we go through this, when we make these passionate calls for change, that the task seems impossible. We may get slapped down, we may get rejected, but we should always remember the words of Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Thanks very much.